Okay. Happy Friday. It's Friday. The end of the week is in sight. Soon you'll be home and you'll be enjoying, well, in my house, we'll be enjoying pizza tonight. It's our little tradition. Um, so I hope your week has been well, and hope you're soon going to be able to rest for a little bit. Today we're continuing on our devotional in Proverbs, and we're in chapter 3, verse 31, working our way one verse at a time. And so I'm just going to deal with that. I want to remind anybody who's been following, or to inform anybody who's just watching this video independent and for the first time perhaps, the verses in Proverbs of the Old Testament of the Bible. We've been working our way through them. And this devotional series is going to go through the whole book eventually over time, dealing with each verse one at a time, because most of the book of Proverbs is that it's a proverb. A single verse is a single concept, and that's what it is. But in these first few chapters of Proverbs, there's a lot of contextual stuff that the other verses matter to, that they create a flow of thought, and that's the case with these verses we're dealing with right at the moment. Verse 31 is part of a section that begins quite a ways back, but sort of at verse 19, where it says that God, with wisdom, founded the earth. And then it talks about how he created the cycle, uses the water cycle as an example, the cycle of the water as an example of how God uses wisdom in order to create a pattern of creation, a rhythm of creation. And then the verses that follow have all been verses talking about us living with wisdom, God's wisdom, proper wisdom, in his world is going to make our life better. And so I've been using this term rhythms of life, or patterns or habits of life. And a number of verses then were about do this, do this, do this, be this kind of person. You'll have a better life. And then the last few verses have been the opposite. It's been like, don't be this, don't do that, because then you'll have a worse life. You'll be out of God's wisdom, and you'll be out of the way he created the world to work, and it'll just be worse for you. So that's the idea. So as we get to verse 31, we've been following this theme of broken rhythms. It started with the idea of kind of like withholding good from people, and then it gets worse. Then you become a person who is like, delaying the good you could do, and then it gets worse, even more, where you're devising harm against a neighbor that really hasn't harmed you, and then it gets worse again, where you're actually gonna contend and actually be, fight with somebody who really hasn't done anything wrong to you. That's yesterday's. And then today, it says in verse 31, do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways, and choose the ways of violence. So we're getting to a more aggressive, overt, violent nature, a destructive nature, a broken rhythm of violence and harm, or malice, or whatever you want to call it. And that's the idea. And this verse here is saying that we shouldn't allow ourselves to envy a man of violence, a person who lives by that way. And so then it says, don't choose his ways. Don't choose any of his ways. Like don't pattern your life after that kind of thing. It's going to make your life worse. Jesus once said to one of his disciples, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." And it's a kind of, that's a pretty good way of putting it. It's like if you choose a life of violence, then you're going to have a life of violence. You're going to choose a life of harm, you're going to have a life of harm. It's going to be worse. It's way better to choose the way God wants us to live. All right, well, let's go to our 4 questions for today. So the first question is, do people actually do this? Do people envy men of violence? Is that a thing? And so let's explore that idea. Do you think that's a very common thing? You might look at your own life and say, I don't think I envy violent men. Like, is that really a thing? And it is, and it may be in a way that we don't usually think. When we think about envy, we usually kind of get the image in our head of the person green with envy, right? The person's so jealous that they're just kind of full of malice, and it's, because I can't have what you have, and maybe you picture somebody at a birthday party and they see that the other kid is getting something they wish they could have, and so they're very upset. And we kind of go to that place in our mind. We think that's what envy is about, and it's not just that. Envy is kind of the idea of I wish I had that. I wish I could have that. I wish I could be that. It's the whole idea of desiring something somebody else has. And so it's more subtle than just the full-on green with envy kind of, teen movie version of envy. It's that subtle part of our lives where we decide that something somebody else has is something I wish I had. I wish I had their thing. And it's not just talking about admiration either. It's a little more than that, but it's this idea. So when we think about our world, do people do that with violent men? Yeah, I would say actually really widespread. Consider, for instance, how incredibly popular dark hero movies are. Movies where the hero is someone like Batman who uses violence to win the day. How incredibly popular those kinds of stories are in our world. Very, very popular. Or consider gangster movies. How very popular gangster movies are, which are movies all about very violent men. Or hitman movies, for instance, very violent men, and they make heroes out of these people. They're the protagonists. We humanize them and make them seem really great, and people watch those movies and they think, oh, how cool the hitman is, right? Or now we have movies that are just simply about villains. Like we literally make villains the protagonists of movies and call them horror movies or whatever, and we make a lot of money off of movies of people going and watching. Is it because they're going to watch someone that they really hate, or is it they're going because there's some sort of an envy, some sort of an admiration for the violence? I think that's what it is. Our culture thinks that even the hero needs to win with violence, and so we have action movies, and I like action movies too. So it's a thing. Like you look at that and you're like, so exciting, and it's not all bad, but we got to be careful, because are we in some ways looking at the violent, dark, not so good attributes of these protagonists and thinking, yeah, I kind of like that. I kind of like, I admire that or whatever. It's a little window into maybe a not so good part of our character. Question two. That's just fiction, right? You might be tempted to say, well, that's just fiction. That's just entertainment. That's not really life. And I would say, yeah, but I'm not so sure. When you look at fiction, you're identifying with the protagonist of a story. One of the things we all do is we find in whoever we're reading or whoever we're watching, whatever the story is, we find the character at the center and we relate to that character in some way. If you watch a movie and the protagonist, you can't relate to them at all, then you will tend to not like the story. You'll tend to back out of it, and it's either boring or uninteresting or disgusting or repulsive. But there's something about the protagonist that you identify with. You connect to them in some way, and then you want to see what happens, and you watch the story for that reason. There's a liking of something, and so it's not just a fiction; it's a thing. So we need to be aware of that and go, yeah, in my life, do I find myself liking those stories because there's something in that is appealing, and we want to be careful. And that's what this proverb is saying. Don't let yourself fall into that way of thinking. But it's not just our fictions. It's not just our movies. It's also in sports. Consider in our culture how many of our sports heroes are boisterous, aggressive, especially in our combat sports. People who are very aggressive and violent in their demeanor, even when being interviewed, and they're pretty popular people, And it's not just our sports either; it's also our music. Consider how much of our music is about in our day and age is about pretty aggressive and violent behavior, especially in the hip hop world. Very aggressive, very violent. But not just there. In other words, I remember when I was younger, Phil Collins. I really like his music. He had a song, "I Can Feel It Coming in the Air Tonight," right? And it was kind of a beat to it, and it was all a whole song about vengeance, physical violence, most likely. It's a thing, and it's not just in our music. There's a reason why bullies have crowds that follow them, right? And you think about in school, and you grow up in school, and there's a bully, and people all come around to see what the bully's going to do. It may be fear of the bully, but it's not just that. There's something in human nature when we look at violence, we look at aggressiveness, and there's something about it that draws us because it's a sense of power, and we think, I'd like to have that power, right? And so this proverb is warning us about that. Don't admire forceful and aggressive, violent power. That kind of power is not good. Is it okay to admire certain confident qualities of the violent man. You might say, well, is there any level of powerfulness that it's okay for us to kind of, envy or like or admire or whatever? And I would say, well, sure, we can admire strength, and we can admire that someone can use strength to overcome a problem. We can admire those things. We can like those things. We can wish for those things in ourselves. I mean, I would say the story of Jesus is a story of a very, very strong man. Um, but it's not strength that's the problem. The problem is violence. And when we talk about violence, we're not just talking about actually the application of strength either. We're talking about that dishonorable, that unjust version of violence, as these proverbs have been saying. Plotting against a neighbor who trusts you, deceiving someone, or contending without cause, or it's talking about that application of strength in a way that causes harm, and it's not just. And so that's not good. But it's okay to admire strength. It's okay to admire ability and confidence and all of those things, and they're good. We just need to be careful, because what happens in our mind is we make an archetype, make a model that we want to follow. We see someone, we go, oh, I admire these qualities about this person. And somewhere in your subconscious, you start to build a model of, I'd like to be like that. So you want to choose someone of strength, but not of violence, or at least of unjust violence. So our last question, is all violence evil? And I included this question because of how the term violence is getting used in our world today in all kinds of weird ways. And so it's worth just noting, by violence, what we're talking about very clearly, as I just said in the last question, but we're not talking about the application of strength that causes the destruction of something. When we use our scientific strength to destroy a virus that's killing us, that's a violence against that virus. And this is not talking about that. When we chop down a tree in order to make a field for a farm, we destroy a tree with physical act of violence against the tree, so to speak. We're not talking about that. That's not violence in the ancient proverb here. That's not what it's talking about. Violence is talking about the idea of the unjust use of forcefulness, of physical in particular, but forcefulness in general, of I'm going to get what I want, even if I have to harm you to get it. That's violence. And that's the ways of violence that these proverbs are warning us about. And we don't want to develop a lifestyle that's aggressive and lacking in gentleness and kindness and benevolence. Of course, we would use violence to defend somebody from a murderer, but the murderer is the violence that this is talking about, the person who's using their violence to force their way into the world. So we don't want to admire that kind of person. We don't want to be that. So that's it. So the question for you today is, do you admire forceful and harmful people? Do you look at them and you think, oh, there's something there that's nice? Do you admire those ways? And if you do, well, maybe just say, God, help me not to. Help me to value something better than that. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to do this. Help us to admire good people with a good moral code. Anyway, that's it for today. God bless you. I will be back on Tuesday, the Lord willing, and we'll go on to verse 32. I hope you have a great weekend. I don't know if you do, but if you wish, you can check out our Sunday video, our teaching on Sunday. It's a little different than this, but something for you to check out if you're interested. Anyway, God bless. Have a great weekend.